The men at that table had killed for less than a refusal. Winter, 1931. They slid a contract across the table and waited. Stephanie St. Clair didn't touch it. What they called arrogance she called the opening move. December 9, 1931. 7:15 in the evening. Snow had been falling on West 48th Street since midday, and the city had gone quiet in the particular way it goes quiet before things change. The restaurant's private dining room was warm and windowless, a narrow space the Syndicate kept reserved for conversations that required no witnesses. 3 men sat at a circular table set with white linen and 2 bottles of untouched Chianti. No food had been ordered. This wasn't a dinner. When Stephanie St. Clair walked through that door, the room shifted. She wore a charcoal wool coat with a fox fur collar, pearl earrings, and carried herself with the measured ease of a woman who had already decided the outcome of this meeting before she crossed the threshold. She didn't look at the men's faces first. She looked at the table. At the single manila envelope placed dead center on the white linen cloth. She sat down. The man at the head of the table, a broad-shouldered Sicilian named Carmine Falcone, who managed Syndicate expansion operations across Upper Manhattan, slid the envelope toward her with 2 fingers. Unhurried. The way a man slides something across a table when he already knows it will be accepted. "Open it," he said. Stephanie looked at the envelope for 3 full seconds. Then she looked at Falcone. She didn't touch it. The second man spoke, younger, careful in his phrasing, precise in his figures. He laid out the offer. The Syndicate was formalizing its presence in Harlem. Her numbers operation, the enterprise she had built over 11 years, corridor by corridor, runner by runner, generated an estimated $42,000 per month. They were prepared to offer 20% of that figure, paid monthly in cash, in exchange for a quiet handover of her collection routes, her networks, and her territory from 110th Street North to 145th. The transition would be complete by February 1, 1932. The third man at the table had said nothing. He sat with his hands folded, watching Stephanie the way men watch problems they expect to solve quickly. Cigar smoke drifted near the ceiling. A clock on the wall marked time. Stephanie let the younger man finish. She didn't interrupt. Didn't take notes. Didn't lift the wine glass. When he was done, silence arrived like a verdict. "No," she said. The word came with a Martinique accent still smooth beneath it after 19 years in New York. Clear, complete, requiring no elaboration. Falcone's expression shifted. "Mississippi St. Clair. Madame St. Clair." The third man made a sound. Barely a laugh. The quiet, private kind that doesn't need volume to carry, the sound of a man mentally filing something under not serious. Stephanie turned and looked at him directly. She held that gaze for 4 full seconds. Without blinking. Without expression. Then she stood. She buttoned her coat, 1 button, 2, 3, with the unhurried precision of a woman who has nowhere more urgent to be. She lifted her handbag from the chair back. She did not take the envelope. "You'll want to remember this evening," she said. Not to any one of them in particular. The date. This room. Exactly what was said. She paused at the door with one gloved hand on the frame. "In a few months, you will need to explain to someone how this arrangement came to end the way it did." She walked out. Behind her, Falcone exhaled and reached for his wine. The third man sat back. In their experience, a woman who refused 20% and walked away from a Syndicate table hadn't made a power move. She'd made a fatal one. What none of them knew, what none of them could have calculated, was that when Stephanie St. Clair stepped out of that restaurant and into the cold December night, she wasn't walking away from a table. She was walking toward the next 12 moves of a game she had begun planning 3 weeks before she ever agreed to sit down. Martinique. The island smelled of hibiscus and sugar cane and the particular kind of exhaustion that settles into a place when it has been owned by someone else for 200 years. Stephanie St. Clair was born into that exhaustion. Born into a French Caribbean colony where the air itself seemed to carry the weight of what was permitted and what was not, of who was seen and who was not, of whose name would be remembered and whose would dissolve into history like salt into water. She watched. From the time she was a small girl, she watched the French colonizers move through the streets of her island with the casual entitlement of men who had never once been told no. She watched her mother's hands, rough from laundry work, precise in their movements, and she learned something early that most people spend their lives trying to unlearn. That the world does not give power. It never has. Power is taken or it is built, slowly and deliberately, out of whatever materials are available. In 1912, at the age of 26, Stephanie St. Clair left Martinique. She arrived at New York Harbor on a gray November morning with $30, 2 dresses, and a command of French so refined it would later make white men in offices assume she had attended schools they hadn't. What she did not have: connections, safety, a plan beyond survival. Harlem in 1912 was an electric place. The Great Migration was drawing thousands of black Americans northward from the South, and New York's Upper Manhattan had become the beating heart of a community in extraordinary motion. Jazz was beginning to climb out of basements. Churches were filling. Barber shops were becoming universities. And on the sidewalks of Lenox Avenue and 125th Street, the business of living was conducted with the urgency of people who understood that the window of possibility was narrow and the cost of hesitation was permanent. Stephanie found domestic work first. She cleaned houses on the Upper West Side, took in alterations, and saved money with the discipline of a woman who understood exactly what money was for. Not comfort. Leverage. There was a winter, 1914, when the work slowed and the money ran out entirely. Stephanie spent 3 weeks eating 1 meal a day, walking everywhere rather than pay the streetcar fare. She didn't ask for help. She simply calculated what she needed, what it would take, how long she was willing to wait. The answer to that last question never changed. As long as necessary. By 1919, she had learned enough about Harlem's informal economy to recognize the architecture of opportunity inside it. The numbers game, a daily lottery run entirely outside the law, entirely inside the community, had existed in Harlem for years. Players chose 3-digit combinations. Runners collected bets, pennies, nickels, sometimes as much as $1, and delivered the slips to bankers who calculated payouts from published horse racing results in the afternoon papers. For a penny bet, a winning number paid $6. The mathematics were always in the banker's favor. The community played regardless. Because in a Harlem where black men were turned away from legal employment, where banks refused loans to black families, and where the Great Depression would soon turn quiet hardship into open catastrophe, the numbers was not merely gambling. It was the only financial system that had not been designed to exclude them. Stephanie understood this. Not sentimentally. Strategically. In 1923 she invested $10,000, accumulated over a decade of calculated saving and several carefully chosen smaller investments, and entered the numbers business as a banker. She was 37 years old. She was a woman. And she was, by every measure that the men already operating in Harlem's numbers world used to assess competition, not a serious threat. They were wrong within 6 months. What separated Stephanie St. Clair from every other numbers operator in Harlem was not her capital. It was her architecture. Where others ran loose networks of runners with no loyalty beyond the next payout, Stephanie built something closer to an institution. She knew every runner by name, by family, by neighborhood grievance, and by personal need. She paid on time, always. She paid fairly, always. When a runner's mother fell sick and he needed a week away from the streets, Stephanie covered his route and made sure his family had food. When a player won and a rival banker tried to slow-walk the payout, word got back to Stephanie before it got anywhere else. Information was her first currency, and she spent 20 years making herself the wealthiest person in Harlem in that particular denomination. By the late 1920s, her operation stretched across 37 city blocks, from 110th Street North to 145th, east from Lenox Avenue to 5th Avenue. She employed over 40 runners, 3 collectors, 2 accountants, and a young man named Ellsworth Johnson, whom the streets were beginning to call Bumpy, who worked as her enforcer when enforcement became necessary. Let the record be clear on this point. Bumpy Johnson came to Stephanie St. Clair. He worked for her, under her direction, at her discretion. He was, in those years, an instrument of her strategy, one tool among many and not always the sharpest one she reached for. Her monthly operation generated between $35,000 and $45,000, depending on the season. She invested in Harlem businesses. She donated to the Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street, a significant sum quietly given without ceremony. She kept a file on every corrupt police officer in the 32nd Precinct, and when they came looking for their unofficial tribute, she paid selectively, documented everything, and waited. Patience was a weapon she had been sharpening since Martinique. She did something no numbers banker in Harlem had thought to do. She used the press. When corrupt officers began shaking down her runners in 1929, Stephanie paid for an advertisement in the New York Amsterdam News, naming officers, badge numbers, specific incidents of extortion. The police commissioner's office received 12 calls about that advertisement. Within 2 weeks, the shakedown stopped. She lived at 409 Edgecombe Avenue in Sugar Hill, the most prestigious address in Black Harlem, a building that housed judges, artists, athletes, and activists. Her apartment was furnished with French antiques and a mahogany desk that faced the window. On clear days she could see the Harlem River. On her desk, ledgers, correspondence, and in the bottom left drawer, a .32 caliber revolver she had purchased in 1924 and had never once needed to use in any situation she could not first resolve with a telephone. This was the woman who sat across from the Syndicate on West 48th Street in December of 1931. Not a gambler. Not a gangster in any sense the word had been designed to capture. Something the English language, frankly, had not yet developed adequate vocabulary for. A black Caribbean immigrant woman who had built a financial institution out of the margins of a society that had given her nothing, who had protected an entire community's economic dignity for a decade, and who had, in the process, become precisely the kind of power that men with connections and guns and legal authority found most threatening. Not because she was violent. Because she was prepared. When the Syndicate sent their representatives to that restaurant with their envelope and their percentages and their February deadline, they were not dealing with a woman who had stumbled into territory she didn't understand. They were sitting across from someone who had spent 19 years learning every pressure point, every leverage mechanism, every legal vulnerability, and every community loyalty that existed between 110th Street and 145th. The third man's laugh had echoed off the walls of that private dining room and dissolved into the December cold before Stephanie had even reached the sidewalk. She had already forgotten it. She had work to do. The first move came 11 days after the West 48th Street meeting. January 20th, 1932. A Tuesday. 3 men Stephanie didn't recognize appeared on the corner of Lenox Avenue and 131st Street at 10 in the morning and stayed until 2 in the afternoon. They didn't buy anything. They didn't speak to anyone. They simply stood where Stephanie's runners worked and watched. The particular, deliberate watching of men who want to be seen watching. By noon, 2 of her runners had walked off that corner and not come back. That was the first move. Stephanie documented it. The second move came 4 days later. January 24th. 2 of her collection men, Marcus Webb, who had worked her northern routes since 1928, and a younger man called Dix, were stopped on 133rd Street between 7th and 8th Avenues at dusk and told, with enough physical persuasion to leave Marcus with a split lip and Dix with 2 broken fingers, that the numbers business in their section of Harlem was under new management. They could keep their routes if they liked. Same routes. Different boss. Marcus showed up at 409 Edgecombe Avenue the next morning. His lip was still swollen. He stood in Stephanie's kitchen and told her everything. The men's descriptions, what they said, the exact words used, the corner where it happened, the time of day, the car they'd arrived in, a black 1930 Packard, and the direction they drove when they left. Stephanie listened to every word. She asked 3 follow-up questions. She poured him a cup of coffee. Then she sat down at her desk, opened the 3rd drawer on the right side, and wrote everything down in her ledger. Not an account ledger. A different one, the one she kept for exactly this kind of information. It had 43 pages already filled. Bumpy Johnson found out about Marcus and Dix the same day. He appeared at Edgecombe Avenue that evening, still wearing his coat and hat, already half decided. Say the word, he said. Stephanie didn't look up from the papers on her desk. Sit down, Ellsworth. They put 2 fingers on Marcus. Sit down. He sat. His jaw was working the way it did when he was holding something back. They want us to respond, Stephanie said. She was reading a document now, not looking at him. A response gives them a reason. A reason gives them a story. A story gives the police a case they bring to us, not them. She turned a page. We are not giving them a reason. Bumpy sat in that chair for a long moment. Then he left. He understood even if he didn't like it. The winter of 1932 pressed down on Harlem. Eating costs had doubled. Work had dried up in the Depression's second full year. Along 125th Street, storefront windows that had held merchandise in 1929 now held nothing but dust. Stephanie's numbers operation was, for many families, the difference between rent paid and furniture on the sidewalk. The Syndicate had calculated the value of her territory in dollars per month. They were counting a business. She was protecting a community. What Bumpy didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Stephanie had been building her counterposition since before the West 48th Street meeting. 3 weeks before she walked into that restaurant, she had made a series of quiet telephone calls. To a retired detective she had known since 1927, who had no love for the Syndicate and considerable love for the retainer Stephanie paid him. To a clerk in the city licensing office whose brother owed Stephanie a debt that had nothing to do with money. To the editor of the New York Amsterdam News, with whom she had cultivated a careful professional relationship over 6 years. She had not told any of them what was coming. She had only asked questions. About ownership structures. About which city officials had recently acquired new interests in certain midtown properties. About which police captains had been transferred to which precincts in the past 18 months. The answers had arrived over the following days, in envelopes, in telephone conversations, in a folded note left under a cup of coffee at a Lenox Avenue diner. Stephanie filed each piece of information in sequence in the ledger in the third drawer, building a picture that the syndicate didn't know was being painted. Meanwhile, their pressure continued. February 3rd. A number spot on 128th Street, a barbershop that had quietly hosted one of Stephanie's collection points for 4 years, received a visit from 2 men who suggested the owner reconsider his business relationships. The owner, a man named Curtis who had 3 daughters and a lease that wasn't up for another 18 months, called Stephanie that evening. His voice was steady but his words came fast. She told him to keep his doors open. She told him his lease was safe. She told him she would handle it. How? He asked. The way I handle everything, she said. Carefully. February 7th. A police sergeant from the 28th precinct named Horace Briggs appeared at another of her collection points and began asking questions. Briggs was not a man Stephanie paid, and he was not a man she feared. He was a man she had already identified, 4 months prior, as having a particular arrangement with a syndicate-connected businessman in the Bronx. She knew the businessman's name, the nature of the arrangement, and the approximate dollar figure involved. When Briggs left the barbershop on 128th Street, Stephanie picked up the telephone. She made one call. Not to Briggs. To someone who knew someone who sat on the same monthly card table as the Bronx businessman in question. Sergeant Briggs never returned to 128th Street. By the second week of February 1932, the syndicate had made 7 distinct moves against Stephanie's operation. 7 acts of intimidation, disruption, and pressure designed to demonstrate the inevitability of their expansion into her territory. Stephanie had responded to none of them with force. She had responded to all of them with documentation. In the syndicate's world, this read as paralysis, as fear, as the slow, dawning acceptance by a woman who had overestimated her own position. This was their first mistake. Their only mistake, as it turned out, was that they kept making it. What they did not understand, what their entire calculation had failed to account for, was that Stephanie St. Clair had never once confused silence for surrender. In her experience, silence was the most accurate signal of all. It meant she was still thinking. And when Stephanie St. Clair was still thinking, it was already too late to stop what came next. Stephanie St. Clair kept a map of Harlem on the wall behind her desk. Not a decorative map. A working one, pencil marks, circles, notations in her small precise handwriting, tracing the corridors of her operation from 110th Street North to 145th Streets she had learned by foot in 1912. Streets she had claimed, block by block, through 20 years of patience and preparation. On the morning of February 10, 1932, she stood in front of that map for 14 minutes without speaking, a cup of coffee cooling on the desk behind her. She had been building this response for 9 weeks. Now it was time to execute it. She called it in her own mind simply, the 10 Streets. Street 1. 125th Street. The New York-Amsterdam News occupied offices at 2293 7th Avenue, and in 1932 it was the most widely read newspaper in Black Harlem, which meant it was the most effective instrument of public pressure available to anyone who understood how to use it. Stephanie called the editor, a measured and careful man named Samuel Ransom, on the morning of February 10th. She did not ask for a favor. She gave him a story. Not a rumor. A documented account. Names, dates, precise locations. What had happened to Marcus Webb on 133rd Street? What had happened at Curtis's barbershop on 128th? The license plate number of the black 1930 Packard. A detailed pattern of syndicate-affiliated men appearing on corners that had been operated exclusively by Black Harlem businesspeople for over a decade. She told Ransom she would provide signed, notarized witness statements from 4 individuals. She told him the story was his to publish exactly as the facts supported it. She told him one other thing quietly before she hung up, that if the paper ran this story, the pressure that followed would be considerable, and she would not forget who had chosen to stand with Harlem's community when it mattered. Ransom published on February 14, 1932. 12 column inches on page 3. The headline read, Syndicate Intimidation in Harlem, White Organized Crime Targets Black Businesses. The telephones at City Hall started ringing before noon that day. 3 of them rang on the desk of a deputy mayor who had, until that morning, been unaware there was a problem requiring his attention. Street 2. 131st Street. There was a federal investigator, a methodical, colorless man Stephanie knew only as Garrett, who maintained an office near Foley Square and had spent the better part of 2 years quietly building a file on Syndicate financial expansion into legitimate business districts across Upper Manhattan. Garrett was not a friend and was not meant to be. He was a man whose institutional purpose intersected with Stephanie's at a specific and useful point, and she had learned long ago that such intersections, managed correctly, were among the most valuable resources available to someone in her position. On February 11th, a sealed envelope arrived at Garrett's office by messenger. Inside, copies of bank records obtained by the retired detective, tracing a financial corridor between Syndicate operational accounts and 2 Midtown enterprises. A property list, 11 addresses in Upper Manhattan where Syndicate-connected figures had quietly acquired silent ownership interests in the past 14 months. And a 6-page summary, written in Stephanie's careful hand, documenting 7 specific acts of intimidation against Black Harlem business operators in the preceding 22 days. Garrett received the envelope on a Wednesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, 2 of the Syndicate's Midtown business contacts had been called in to answer questions they had not anticipated and had not prepared for. Stephanie knew about the Thursday afternoon questions before the Syndicate did. Street 3. 133rd Street. The men who had broken Dix's fingers on 133rd Street had made a technical error. They had done it in plain view. 3 witnesses. A woman named Pearl who ran a hat-pressing operation from her ground-floor apartment on that block. An elderly man named Roosevelt who sat in front of his building every afternoon regardless of weather or temperature. And a 14-year-old boy who delivered newspapers on 133rd every evening and had an excellent memory for faces and car descriptions. Stephanie had spoken to all 3 by February 8th. She had their signed statements, written in her presence, witnessed by the retired detective, notarized at a private office on 132nd Street, before the Syndicate had time to consider whether anyone had been paying attention. She delivered copies to 3 separate destinations: the district attorney's review desk, Garrett's growing federal file, and a locked drawer in her mahogany desk at 409 Edgecombe Avenue. She kept the originals herself. This was deliberate. The originals stayed with her because the originals, in the event of any negotiation, were the item of greatest value. Street 4. 128th Street. Curtis had kept his barbershop open. Every morning he unlocked the front door at 8 o'clock, turned the sign, and waited for customers who came, not as many as before but enough. This mattered beyond what it appeared. In a neighborhood watching carefully to see whether Stephanie St. Clair could hold her ground, every business that stayed open was a declaration. Every light that stayed on in a window was a position being defended. Stephanie spent 3 evenings in the second week of February moving through the neighborhood alone, visiting the operators who ran her collection points. She went without Bumpy. Without visible security of any kind. She went in her fox fur coat with a pair of gloves and the unhurried manner of a woman conducting business she had every right to conduct. She sat in each shop, at the counter or across a back table, and spoke quietly about what was happening, what she was doing about it, and what she needed. What she needed was simple: continued operation, continued documentation, and continued loyalty. What she offered in return was equally clear. No one would be abandoned. No lease would be lost. No family would face consequences for a loyalty that Stephanie St. Clair had asked for and received. By February 15th, all 37 collection points in her network remained operational. The Syndicate, which had anticipated 5 to 8 closures by mid-month, had no explanation for this. Street 5. 138th Street. The Abyssinian Baptist Church stood at 132 West 138th Street, and in 1932 it was the institutional center of Harlem's civic life, a congregation that included judges, physicians, teachers, union organizers, and the kind of deeply rooted community authority that external money could not buy and external pressure could not easily dislodge. The Reverend knew Stephanie St. Clair. Not as a numbers operator. As the woman who sat in the third row every Sunday without exception, who gave without ceremony, and who, on more than 3 separate occasions in recent years, had quietly arranged for rent assistance to reach families whose names appeared in the church's private welfare register. He had never asked her the source of the funds. She had never offered to explain it. On February 12th, Stephanie sat in his office for 40 minutes. She asked for nothing dramatic. She asked only that the church's community board be made aware of the pattern of organized intimidation currently affecting their neighborhood's small business owners. Awareness, she noted, had a way of generating the kind of sustained civic attention that made certain activities considerably more expensive to continue. The following Sunday, the Reverend delivered a sermon on the duty of community protection. The Amsterdam News printed a summary of it the following Thursday. He did not mention Stephanie by name. He didn't need to. Everyone in Harlem already understood whose interests were being defended from the pulpit of the most important church in Upper Manhattan. Street 6, Lenox Avenue and 140th Street. At 8:15 in the morning on February 17, Stephanie arrived at a coffee shop on the corner of Lenox and 140th, the kind of establishment where discreet conversations had been happening between careful people for 20 years. She ordered coffee. She set a thin folder on the table. Councilman Arthur Simmons arrived 4 minutes later. He had represented Harlem's 19th district for 6 years, and he was not a corrupt man, a fact Stephanie had verified with considerable care before she ever arranged this meeting. He was, however, a pragmatic one, and pragmatic men in Stephanie's experience responded best to specific, well-organized information presented without theater or urgency. The folder contained 3 documents. First, a chronological account of the Syndicate's activity within his district over the past 30 days. Second, documentation of 2 separate instances of police complicity involving officers from the 28th Precinct. Third, a financial summary demonstrating the economic disruption to approximately 40 small businesses, all tax-paying, all legitimate on their surface, resulting from the Syndicate's intimidation campaign. Simmons studied the folder for 7 full minutes. He asked 2 questions. Stephanie answered both completely. He called a colleague in the city comptroller's office that same afternoon. By the following morning, 2 separate inquiries had been opened into business licensing irregularities connected to syndicate-affiliated properties in Upper Manhattan. Streets 7 through 10. The remaining 4 moves were quieter, the kind of actions that leave no visible trace and produce consequences that appear, to those receiving them, to emerge from no discernible source. Street 7. The retired detective's complete file on corruption within Stephanie's territory, 3 officers, 6 documented incidents spanning 18 months, supported by bank records and counter-surveillance photographs, was delivered to an internal affairs contact at the NYPD on the morning of February 18. 2 of the 3 officers involved were summoned for questioning within the week. Street 8. Stephanie transferred $112,000 of operational reserve funds across 3 separately structured financial arrangements in institutions that carried no exposure to syndicate-connected interests. The syndicate had built its strategy partly around the assumption of her financial vulnerability. They had been calculating against money she had already moved 6 weeks before they made their first move against her. Street 9. Bumpy Johnson, redirected at Stephanie's instruction from enforcer to intelligence coordinator, spent 10 days ensuring that every runner in her network understood their assignment precisely. Observe, remember, and report. Nothing more. The information that flowed back through that network over the following 2 weeks was more operationally complete than anything the syndicate's men had anticipated her possessing. Street 10 was different from the other 9. It was not a document, a meeting, a financial transfer, or a press placement. It was a single telephone call, placed on the evening of February 20, 1932, to a man whose name Stephanie had never written in any ledger and never would. A man who, years earlier, had accepted a significant financial courtesy from Stephanie St. Clair at a moment when such a courtesy had meant the difference between a problem resolved and a problem that could have ended his career entirely. He owed her. He knew it. She had never collected. Until now. The call lasted 4 minutes. She asked for one specific thing. Information about the internal syndicate communication regarding the timing and method of their planned final move against her operation. Nothing more. She did not ask him to act. She did not ask him to testify. She asked only for what he knew and for the courage to tell her. He called her back at 7:40 the following morning. She listened. She thanked him. She set the receiver down on its cradle without sound. Then she opened the ledger in the 3rd drawer, picked up her pen and wrote the date, the time, and 7 words. She closed the ledger. She sat back in her chair and looked at the map on the wall. At the pencil marks. The circles. The 20 years of patient architecture spread across 37 city blocks of the greatest black neighborhood in America. For the first time in 9 weeks, Stephanie St. Clair took a single, quiet, unhurried breath. She knew exactly when the trap would close. She knew exactly what it would cost them. And she knew, with the particular certainty of a woman who had never made a move without calculating its end, that they were already too far inside it to find the door. March 3, 1932 arrived on a Monday with thin gray light and the particular stillness that settles over a city when something is about to change. Stephanie had been expecting this day for 11 days. She had written its date in her ledger on the morning of February 21st, 7 words in her small precise hand, and had spent the intervening time preparing for it the way she prepared for everything, methodically, without rush and several moves ahead of the moment. By March 3, the 10 streets had produced their full accounting. The Amsterdam news story had been reprinted in part by 2 additional papers. 3 civic organizations had written letters to the mayor's office. Garrett's federal inquiry, which had existed as a quiet background process before Stephanie's envelope arrived, now had her documentation as its central exhibit, and 2 syndicate-connected businessmen in Upper Manhattan had quietly retained legal counsel for reasons they declined to discuss publicly. Sergeant Briggs of the 28th Precinct had been placed on administrative review pending an internal affairs inquiry that had been opened, as far as anyone could determine, from no identifiable source. Councilman Simmons had initiated a formal review of business licensing practices in his district. The Amsterdam News had published a second article, this one about the community's organized response to outside interference, and been reprinted in a black newspaper in Philadelphia. And the third man from the West 48th Street meeting, the one who had made the small private sound that was not quite a laugh, was no longer attending to syndicate business in Upper Manhattan. He was attending to his own legal situation, which had become, over the preceding 2 weeks, considerably more complex than he had anticipated when he decided a Caribbean woman's refusal was something worth finding amusing. Carmine Falcone arrived at 409 Edgecombe Avenue at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He came with 1 man instead of 2. He came to Stephanie's building on Stephanie Street in Stephanie's neighborhood, without being invited. She had expected him the day before. He was 1 day late. The doorman let them up. Stephanie had left word to expect them. She was at her desk when they entered. She did not stand. She gestured to the 2 chairs positioned across from her. Chairs she had placed that morning at a precise angle that left both men, when seated, positioned slightly below her eye level. A small advantage. Every advantage counted. Falcone's face carried the particular strain of a man who has spent 2 weeks discovering that a situation he believed he controlled had been, for its entire duration, in someone else's hands entirely. He sat down without greeting her. His companion, a younger, less practiced man named Vincent who had been sent, Stephanie suspected, because the man who normally accompanied Falcone was now preoccupied with the questions being asked of him at Foley Square, kept his hands flat on his knees and said nothing. "You should have called ahead," Stephanie said. She was reviewing a document. She did not put it down. "We need to discuss what has been happening," Falcone said. "I agree," Stephanie said. She set the document aside, folded her hands on the desk, and looked at him with the calm attention of a woman who had rehearsed nothing because she needed to rehearse nothing. "Shall I go first, or would you prefer to?" Falcone's jaw moved. "The business at Foley Square is a federal matter," Stephanie said. "It was a federal matter before your men set foot on my corners. I didn't create that file, Carmine. I contributed to it. There's a considerable difference." The use of his first name was deliberate. She watched him receive it. "The newspaper reported documented facts," she said. "Every incident, every date, every license plate, every name confirmed by 2 independent sources." She paused. "Including yours. In 3 places." Vincent shifted in his chair. "What I want to know," Falcone said, and his voice had descended to the register of a man making a final argument, "is what it takes for this to stop." Stephanie looked at him without speaking for 5 full seconds. Then she opened the middle drawer of her desk and removed a single typed page. She placed it on the desk between them without pushing it toward him. She placed it precisely where he would need to lean forward to read it. He leaned forward. The page contained 3 items. The first, the case numbers of the 2 active federal inquiries, each accompanied by a brief notation indicating what additional documentation Stephanie held that had not yet been submitted to Garrett's office. Documentation that, if delivered, would advance each inquiry by several months and implicate several additional parties. The second, a list of 8 syndicate-affiliated business operations in Upper Manhattan that would become subject to city licensing review within 5 business days of a letter currently in Stephanie's possession being delivered to Councilman Simmons. The third, the name, badge number, and complete documented financial history of a senior officer in the 32nd Precinct who had been accepting syndicate payments since 1929, a file prepared for delivery to Internal Affairs on 48 hours' notice. Falcone read the page. He read it a second time. What it takes, Stephanie said quietly, is straightforward. Complete withdrawal from Harlem's numbers territory. Every corner, every collection point, every arrangement currently operating under syndicate pressure. Withdrawn. Fully. Permanently. She let that settle for 2 seconds. In exchange, the letter to Simmons is not delivered. The officer's file remains in my desk. I make no further submissions to the federal inquiry. She folded her hands. I have no interest in destroying your organization, Carmine. I have interest only in my territory, my community, and the work we have conducted here for 11 years without interference. And if we don't agree, Falcone said. He already knew the answer. She could see it in the way he asked. Not a threat, not a negotiating position. The arithmetic of a man doing a final calculation. Then everything I have described continues, Stephanie said. At whatever pace I determine. On whatever schedule serves Harlem's interests. Pause. You know what I accomplished in 3 weeks with what I had prepared before you ever walked into that restaurant on West 48th Street. I suggest you think carefully about what 3 months looks like. The room held its silence. Outside, on Edgecombe Avenue, a streetcar moved along the tracks. The sound came and faded. Vincent was studying the floor. Falcone was looking at the typed page, though Stephanie had already returned it to the middle drawer, folded her hands, and resumed reading the document she had been reviewing when they arrived. He was looking, she understood, at where the page had been. I need to make some calls, Falcone said. Of course, Stephanie said without looking up. That's all? Vincent said. The words came out younger than he intended. Stephanie did not raise her eyes from the document. Yes, she said. That's all. Falcone and Vincent were gone by 2:47 in the afternoon. Bumpy Johnson came up from the lobby 15 minutes later and knocked twice on the open door. Well, he said. Stephanie was at the window. The Harlem River was visible through the winter trees, and the light across it had the uncertain quality of a season about to turn. Not spring yet, but no longer fully winter. It's done, she said. Bumpy stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who had prepared himself for a louder story, one with more noise and smoke and visible consequence. That's it. Stephanie turned from the window and looked at him with the measured patience of a woman who had never once required volume to demonstrate authority. That's it, she said. After he left, she was alone with it for the first time since December. 9 weeks of absolute discipline, of absolute refusal to let any of them see what she was thinking or fearing, and there had been fear, she would not lie to herself about that. In the small hours of certain February mornings, with the ledger open on the desk and the apartment perfectly quiet, she had been afraid that she'd missed something. A gap she hadn't closed. A witness who wouldn't hold. A seam in the architecture. None of those things had happened. She let herself acknowledge that. Quietly. Without ceremony. The way she acknowledged most things. She opened the ledger in the third drawer, picked up her pen and wrote 3 words beside March 3rd. Terms accepted. Done. She closed the ledger. She called Marcus Webb. She told him his routes were clear, and to let the others know, and to take the rest of the day. When she set the phone down, the apartment at 409 Edgecombe Avenue in Sugar Hill was perfectly quiet. Stephanie St. Clair returned to work. The word moved through Harlem the way all important words moved in the spring of 1932, not through newspapers, not through official announcements, but through the measured silences between conversations. A barbershop on 128th Street. A church vestibule on 138th. A stoop on Lenox Avenue where 3 women stood in the first real warmth of March sunlight, speaking in a register just low enough to be private and just loud enough to confirm what they already suspected. The syndicate was gone. By the final week of March 1932, the withdrawal was complete. The black 1930 Packard that had idled on corners from 115th to 143rd Street for 9 weeks was seen no more. Carmine Falcone transferred his primary operations south to Midtown, a retreat confirmed in a single paragraph in the New York-Amsterdam News of March 28, which noted, without naming names, that certain commercial pressures in Upper Manhattan had resolved themselves to the satisfaction of the affected community. Samuel Ransom, the paper's editor, knew exactly what that sentence meant. So did everyone who read it. The numbers operation continued, as it had since 1923, and would continue until forces larger than any single syndicate reshaped the city a decade later. But something had changed in the texture of the enterprise. When Marcus Webb walked his routes in April 1932, the shop owners who had shuttered their back rooms during the January intimidations now left doors open. Curtis, the barbershop owner on 128th Street who had kept his 3 daughters home from school during the worst weeks of the pressure, Sent a jar of pickled limes to 409 Edgecombe Avenue. No note. None was required. The runners, too, moved with a different quality of certainty. Dix, whose broken fingers had been splinted by a Harlem physician in January and who had returned to his route in February without being asked, later said that what changed after March was not the money or the safety. What changed was the knowledge of what the operation was actually worth. Worth defending. Worth the 11 years that preceded the winter of 1932. Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, who had pressed for violent response in January and been refused, carried what he learned from Stephanie St. Clair for the rest of his life. He would say years later, and historians would note it, that she had taught him the difference between a show of power and the actual possession of it. He went on to become one of the most significant figures in Harlem's mid-century underworld, but the architecture of his thinking, patience, community loyalty, leverage over spectacle, bore the unmistakable influence of the woman he had worked for. The Syndicate was not finished with Harlem. In 1935, Dutch Schultz, a figure who had shadowed the city's underground for years, launched his own, more aggressive incursion into the numbers territory. He succeeded where Falcone had not, at least temporarily, using levels of violence Stephanie had refused to meet on equal terms. She responded not with force but with the courts and the press, a strategy that had cost her territory in the short term but preserved her name, her standing, and ultimately her freedom, when Schultz himself was murdered in a Newark chop house in October 1935. Stephanie famously sent a telegram to the authorities, "I always knew God was on my side." The line was reprinted in 4 newspapers. Nobody laughed. She continued to fight, through the courts, through the press, through the deliberate, exhausting, unglamorous work of documentation. She was arrested multiple times, jailed once, and subjected to years of police harassment that she logged as methodically as she had logged every intimidation in 1932. In 1938 she married Sufi Abdul Hamid, a labor organizer and community leader. The marriage was brief and difficult, marked by a shooting incident. She fired on him after a reported threat that led to her confinement at Mattawan State Hospital. The courts, which had never shown her fairness, showed her little now. But Harlem remembered differently. What the community preserved was not the court records, not the arrest files, not the photographs of the hospital. What they preserved, in oral history, in the newspapers she had used so precisely as instruments, in the testimony of people like Marcus Webb and Curtis and the unnamed women on the stoop on Lenox Avenue, was the winter of 1932, and what one woman had done in it. She had not arrived in this country with power. She had arrived with $30, 2 dresses, and the capacity to construct leverage out of nothing more than consistency, intelligence, and an absolute refusal to be bought. Stephanie St. Clair died on December 1, 1969 in New York City, the same city she had entered 57 years earlier as an immigrant woman from Martinique with no connections, no capital, and no expectation from any institution that she would amount to anything at all. She had built an empire, defended it without firing a single shot during its most critical siege, protected hundreds of families through the worst years of the Depression. And she had left, as her only recorded explanation for all of it, a single line that appeared in the Amsterdam News during the worst weeks of 1932. "I am not afraid of men who take. I am only careful of the ones who think taking is permanent." She was right about that too.